And given the conversation in the room, I think it'd be better if we just dive into some questions to the panel first, and then we'll open it up to questions in the room and try and give as many people as possible the opportunity to ask questions. I'm going to start with Penny, if that's okay. Penny, do you want to talk a little bit about the government action that's underway to increase the effective use of technology investment?
Sure. So I think everybody's seen from the presentation early on the sorts of things that we're struggling with at the moment. Health systems are looking at a range of new technologies across lots of different modalities for health, and it's quite confusing for people involved in health financing as how we work out what we should be investing in, what's our most rational course of investment. So I think one of Hugh's examples was using mammography. We also have 3D breast tomosynthesis and potentially ultrasound as well. So how do we work out what's the best investment to help people who might be identifying breast cancer, and how do we compare the different investments? So in the Commonwealth Department of Health, we have been pulling together all of our experts in health technology assessment, and we do actually have quite a long history of health technology assessment in Australia. In 1993, we introduced to the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme mandatory health technology assessment-based listing. So under our legislative framework, where the government is not able to invest in new medicines unless they've been through an expert process that looks at the cost of the medicine, the clinical benefit it provides to the community, the appropriate patient groups, and we derive an incremental cost effectiveness ratio and look at that to determine where investments in new medicine should be made. And we have a long history compared to many other countries, and we often provide our views and experiences to other countries who are looking at challenges that they have with increases in the cost of medicines. But we also have the Medical Services Advisory Committee, which for a long time has been looking at different hospital-based services and whether or not we should be investing in those. We also have a process for assessing medical devices and whether or not private health insurance benefits should be paid for those under the Prostheses List Advisory Committee. So we've pulled together all of our experts who are involved in those processes to sit in what's now called the Office of Health Technology Assessment in the department. And as a first stage, we've been looking at how we can expand some of those approaches to other programs that we fund. We have national diabetes investments for people who need needles and continuous glucose monitoring devices, things like that, to help them manage their diabetes. But we're also positioning the experts that we have at the Commonwealth level to help our colleagues in states and territories, because people who are running the public hospital system are facing exactly the same challenges in trying to work through what new technologies we should be investing in. And it's really accelerating quite a lot because we have now genomic technologies, which in some cases are potentially curative, and we need to be able to properly assess whether or not we should be making significant investments in these technologies, which will potentially avoid 30, 40 years worth of hospital costs for very sick people. But we need to consider important things like intergenerational cost transfer and things like that if we've got very high upfront investments. So it's something that we're spending a lot of time looking at the moment.
Thank you, and I'm sure there'll be questions from the floor to you, Penny, about all those points, really important points. You mentioned medical devices, and Andrew, when I think of, say, the pharma industry, I know that it takes maybe about 19 years from concept to drug reaching the market. On average, that's the European average. I'm just wondering, in terms of your knowledge of the medical devices industry, what do they see on the horizon?
Yes, so thank you for the question. And again, I think you called out one of the unique challenges for the medical technology sector is that much of our assessment and evaluation processes are based initially on pharma methodology, and the pace of change in medical technology can be much faster than that. It doesn't tend to have the same timeframes, and it tends to be iterative as well, so a change happens quite quickly. But there's some big leaps potentially coming in the future as well. Robotics is one that Hugh mentioned that potentially makes big changes. Drug device combinations, so devices that deliver drugs, devices that are enhanced by drugs, the miniaturization of devices, devices which are less invasive, so that move care pathways outside of hospitals, for example, or in lower acuteness settings within hospitals. Those all provide challenges for reimbursement and assessment for medical technology. But there's a huge amount of change happening, and some of the big trends that you've mentioned are either directly in the medical devices space or are supported by medical devices, medical technology, including software.
Thank you. Hugh, you mentioned on the platform, and then while we were eating lunch, we talked about workforce, and you mentioned machine learning and the impacts on diagnostics. I remember 25 years ago, one of the biggest challenges I had as a hospital CEO was actually recruiting cytology readers. Mainly actually young women, not very well paid, who would look down a microscope and every 15 minutes had to take a break while they were reading cytology. Now that machine learning is taking that over, which is great news, I think. What do you think is going to happen to the workforce in the diagnostic space within health?
Well, I think the obvious conclusion is that the jobs don't go, but you need fewer of them.
Okay.
So, will I get rid of radiologists? No, but what the radiologist needs to do in order to be effective, that will change. In other words, the machine will do the initial pre-screen, will take away a lot of the base load, and then the radiologist's job is to, first of all, confirm. You still need that human confirmation, but more importantly, to actually help the patient understand what the implications are and how to manage the condition.
And talking about patients and thinking about patients and consumers as a whole, I work in an organisation where the average age is 27, so I'm part of the diversity. And I'm just wondering what the panel think about the role that consumers will play in the future in terms of driving the demand for technology. Does anyone have a view on that?
Oh, no, I mean, I think there's a very clear trend that consumers are being far more engaged in health choices and actively researching their options for health. They are looking at outcomes and they are making decisions. I think probably where we are at the moment is they probably generally don't have enough information to be able to do that well. So that's, I think, the challenge for the medical profession and for health in general, is to get that balance right between providing the right kind of information for people so that they can make choices, because clearly consumers do want to make those choices, but making the right choices.
Penny, was there anything you wanted to add?
Yes, so I think if we look at the sorts of things that are driving inflation in health costs, not just in Australia but around the world, it's ageing, it's increasing prevalence of chronic disease, but the third big one is increasing expectations from the community about their health and their quality of life. So it is certainly something that we have to be cognizant of in designing our health system, because patients want to be able to access new technology, they want to live longer and more productive lives, and they expect that we will, through industry, government partnerships, deliver that for them. And one of the things that we've been doing is trying to get consumers more engaged in our assessment processes that work out what we actually invest health dollars in, because we do need to know, as part of the rational decision-making process, if we do have a medical device like a replacement hip, we want to know that people who've had that hip put into them are feeling better than they were before they had that hip replacement surgery. Has it been worth it for you? Is your life after a new hip what you expected it to be? If we're going to fund hundreds of thousands of dollars for a new cancer medicine, we want to know that the patient, and we do know that on average for many of these medicines they'll only live for an extra 2 or 3 months. But is that 2 or 3 months worthwhile for you? Are you violently ill while you're on that drug? So we really need to be hearing from the consumers and building more of our investment strategy around what they want and whether they get those outcomes.
Huge overview on that, and particularly the ethical dilemma of quite a lot of expense for another 2 or 3 months of life.
Yeah, I actually held a conference last year, and this topic came up in great detail. It's the statistics in intensive care are something like 80% of the people in intensive care won't last more than a year. Is that the right one? But the problem is, with the rate of change, will that 2 or 3 months buy me time to get to a new treatment that will save my life and cure the cancer after that? We just don't know. I would hate to make that decision, and all the doctors I know just don't want to make that decision. They don't want to be involved in it, and I have sympathy for that.
When I think of lots of industries and you think about technology being added in, it often, not always, but often drives down price, and yet within health it doesn't seem to be working that way. Do people have views about why that's the case? Penny, you smiled.
Well, I have lots of views about that. So I think, first of all, we've got some, because we have a lot of private sector players in this market, we will have people who develop commercial strategies based on where they can maximise return on their investment dollar. And, that's as you'd expect people to behave in our society if they're running a business. So first of all, we do have a lot of expensive therapies that are targeted on very small patient populations because you can maximise return on investment from those investments. But we also have new technologies that are potentially curative, and I mentioned this earlier. And in the sort of current health investment framework that we have, and health technology assessment and looking at outcomes and whether or not the dollar we invest is worth that outcome, if you're trying to apply that methodology to a curative therapy, you're looking at very high prices. And I think the approaches we have been taking are going to have to change because we're not going to be able to afford those incredibly high upfront investments, which otherwise would have been paid over a person's lifetime in health costs. And this is something that I'm actually involved in an OECD working group on discussing at the moment. Because I guess in industry's perspective, we should be looking at Harvey Norman payment plan type arrangements where there's a commitment to pay for a technology that's very expensive over a longer period of time so that governments can afford that. But there are intergenerational cost transfer issues that we have to consider there. And also, does that then stifle the development of further better technologies? If we're still paying for something that was the best available 10 years ago, that's less money and the opportunity costs are quite real. So I think the investment framework needs to change in health, and we are going to have to expect more philanthropy, more risk sharing between communities and governments and the companies that are investing in technology.
And Andrew, do you have a view about the rising cost of technology?
Yeah, and I think, I'd agree with much of what Penny said, is that one of the problems, which I think was well identified by Porter at Harvard around the value-based healthcare, was that fee-for-service drives behaviour. And it's very clear to see that it's economics 101, is that if you put incentives in place for volume or number of procedures or number of interactions, then you will get people building their business models based on that. The Porter idea is to turn that around to paying for outcomes. And I think most governments, most people, most taxpayers are willing to invest money for health outcomes as long as they get some kind of assurance that they'll get the outcome they paid for. And much of traditional HTA, health technology assessment, is around trying to reduce the amount of uncertainty in the decision-making process, saying, well, if we don't really know what the outcome's going to be, we either don't want to pay for it or we want to pay less for it until we're sure of what the outcome is. Turning some of those models around to say, well, okay, the people who are providing the service, and you need everybody involved in that to participate in a situation where, say, well, we're all going to go at risk for the outcome. We'll get paid a percentage of the input when we get the outcome that we promised. And if we don't get it, we either don't get paid or we have a penalty or we get paid less. And I think that really focuses the mind of everybody in this. So device companies, clinicians, hospitals, everybody to say, well, we're not going to get paid unless we get this right. So we better figure out how to do this, not just well, but efficiently, because that's where our profit's going to come from as well. So it's a really different way of looking at things. It's very difficult to implement in health systems that have been built up on fee-for-service for generations.
Can I give a slightly different perspective? I think a lot of it's inertia in the system. So just take a simple example. If you have to have, you go to a cardiologist, they'll often send you off to have a Holter monitor. That has to be fitted by a technician. It's a 6-lead or 12-lead ECG that's on you. You can't do normal activities. And so it takes a particular measurement at 24 hours. It's not a normal measurement. Now, those single lead ECGs I talked about, you can actually buy these things for a couple of $100. My cardiologist is prepared to accept them. He gets enough detail out of those results. But the standard process, the system, everyone expects that you'll be sent to a pathologist who will make a couple of $1,000 out of you and fit this thing on, which does an improper measurement. No one's thinking of, let's cut that guy out of the system and make it much more effective.
By the way, we've got a device to solve that problem. I can talk to you about it later.
I thought we agreed no selling from the platform.
Didn't mention a name.
Hugh, if staying with you, if you don't mind, with all your experience in terms of working in technology, have you got a view about what are the drivers to make technology be implemented more quickly? What are the lessons that you've seen from Australia or other parts of the world?
I think the biggest driver is that the people I've seen who are most successful in innovation are the people who have an itch they want to scratch. They've got a problem they want to solve. When I get to meet kids who say, I want to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to be an innovator, and I go, oh my God, let me out of here. Because the people you really want to meet are the ones who say, I'm going to solve this particular problem. And those are all the successful people I know have started that way.
Anyone else have a view on that before I move on? No, okay. I'm learning to pick up the signals. How, in a world where health is changing rapidly and technology is playing a major role in that, would you have just the panel have a view about the role that regulation might play? And in fact, how does regulation keep up? Andrew, you nodded.
Willing to have a go at that. So, I mean, I think there is a real challenge with the pace of change at the moment for regulation to keep up with it, and we see that every day. I mean, software as a medical device is a great example of that. Drug-device combinations are good examples of that, but software is a really big one. So, you know, you mentioned the Amazons and Googles you in your presentation. You know, there's a lot of companies producing very cheap, very accessible apps, software, devices that can, you know, be purchased at low cost. The crossover between when they're just a informational device to where it's actually providing medical advice and you know, interventions is a grey area that all regulators globally are struggling with. You know, it has potential to significantly reduce the costs of healthcare, because if you get it out there in high volume at low cost, it potentially reduces the costs, but the challenge is knowing which ones work and which ones don't, and which ones are harmful and which ones are not, which is always the struggle for regulators everywhere. And I don't think we've got a solution to that yet. I mean, I think people are looking at it, people are struggling to come to terms with it, but that change is just going to get faster and faster. You know, the best we can do is try to build regulatory systems that are as flexible as possible, that are as adaptable as possible, and you know, to go back to, I guess, my previous point, particularly on the payment, probably not so much on the safety aspect, is willing to go at risk for the outcome, so that all participants are willing to go at risk for the outcome and the payment to resolve some of the uncertainties in the process.
Do you want to add something?
So, you know, we need flexible but risk-based regulation. It's essential that we, you know, are making sure that people aren't using health technology that's going to cause them harm. And the reason we've got the TGA is because of thalidomide and all of the, you know, dreadful outcomes we experienced there. So, you know, there are real reasons we have to have regulation, and it has to be strong. And, you know, I think basically we come down on the side of regulation if we're not sure. But we can take more risk around the reimbursement frameworks. Yeah. And, you know, we do. We have managed access arrangements. And I'm looking forward to actually rolling those out to devices. Devices, I think, lend themselves to more post-market monitoring than, you know, medicines do, which are much easier to assess up front. And that's what the government's committed to do with the Medical Technology Association of Australia. We're going to have more opportunities to fund new things as long as we're collecting good evidence, good data about how they're performing, and then we can share the risk down the track if we need to.
But I mean, the safety aspect is the more problematic one, is knowing the right level, because again, there's the there's the type 1, type 2 statistical error issues, is that, sometimes you can do more harm by preventing access to something, but you'll never know. You'll never measure that harm. You'll never be able to compensate people from that harm. It's much easier to measure real harm that happens from you do give access to somebody and it turns out to be dangerous, then at least you know who's been impacted and you can stop it. You can never stop a harm that you've caused by not allowing access, because you can't measure it. So it's a difficult question, and I don't pretend that anyone's got an easy answer to that one.
Just before I throw this open to the room, linking back to your access question, I've been here 2.5 years now, and I realise it's a really big country. And so equitable access is a real challenge for health systems across Australia. Do you have a view about how technology might help improve that? Hugh?
Well, certainly telemedicine is giving a geographic access that's unprecedented. I'm not sure if it's being applied as much as it should be, but and there are a lot of things you can do, monitoring and diagnostics as well. So that makes a big difference. So probably the more difficult equity issue is between, and Penny touched on this, is between the ignorant and the informed.
Yes.
And I'm not sure how you address with it. I have a theory that a lot of people are ineducable, and so I don't know how you're going to deal with that group.
Are these people wearing the tin hats? Yeah.
They work for newspapers. Oh, sorry.
Before this descends, do you want anything you'd like to add about access and equity of access with technology?
So I think telemedicine is certainly something that's going to help us get more services to people in rural and remote areas. We've had specialist consultations covered under telehealth items in the medical benefits scheme for about 7 years now, and remote monitoring and things like that. So I think there have been benefits. But again, we've still got some risk conversations to have around expanding it further. So the medical profession as a whole is still not convinced that undifferentiated patients going to a GP suitable to be seen through video conferencing technology. And I mean, that might change over time as the technology improves, but it's something that we have to deal with if we are going to get better access to services to the really remote communities.
Great, thank you. I'll open to the floor if that's okay. So questions to the floor from the floor then. Hands up and we'll get the microphone over. Hold on a second. Can we take the microphone? Can we just...
David Hurd, GSK.
Hi.
This is all to all panellists. So first of all, thank you. Thanks for your talk earlier, Hugh, and thanks for the panel. Are we learning enough from our global partners in health in terms of systems, processes, application of technology as it diversifies? Do we actually look to other public health programs in other jurisdictions to learn from that to apply in Australia? So not built here, we're not interested, is the kind of scenario. So should we be looking more diversely across the globe?
Great question. Who wants to start?
I'll let Penny deal with that.
So we're definitely interested. Australia doesn't build too much stuff itself. Most of the technology we are looking at comes from overseas. It has its first interaction, I suppose, with the TGA in terms of market authorisation. And our market authorisation processes have been reformed quite significantly over the last couple of years for medicines. We're heading in that direction now for devices, so that we're certainly looking at what's already been proven and approved in other markets. From a reimbursement perspective, which is mostly what I deal with, we share a lot of our experiences with other comparable countries. So we've got NICE in the United Kingdom, which has an awful lot of experience in assessing health technology and is happy to share that with us. We also have strong relationships with the assessment bodies in Canada. And we share a lot of our expertise locally in the Asian region now as well. We've got regular meetings with countries like Japan and South Korea. So we do try and learn from what's happening in other countries overseas, but always, looking for more opportunities to scan what's going on out there. And I have to say, it's actually medicines companies who often put us in contact with useful people to talk to overseas, which is quite useful for me.
I would make one comment. Australia has a stunningly strong health research environment. We are genuinely world leaders. So yes, I think that inevitably leads to a global interaction because we can stand toe-to-toe with the leaders in the world. The area where we're not learning enough is in health records, where we've been messing around with this problem for the last 30 years and seemingly make no progress. And when we're finally getting on the threshold of making progress with an opt-out system, a whole lot of people come out of the woodwork. All the Amish come out of the woodwork and want to stop it.
Anything you want to add?
Yeah. So look, I'd certainly say a few different things. One is, I think on medical technology in particular, we're definitely not there yet in terms of recognising safety regulatory work that's done elsewhere. I think there's some pathways in train to try and improve that. We'll have to wait to see till it's implemented how far it's gone and how successful it's been. But we're doing way too much of that in a duplicative way in Australia. But I think as you start to work around some of the health systems around the world, a lot of structural stuff is health system specific. And Australia has a unique, every country has a unique health system. Ours is unique in its own ways. The balance, back to the cost of healthcare, we're actually in a really good spot. We spend about the middle of the world in terms of percentage of GDP, and our outcomes are at the top. So, again, we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves about where we are on that space. So I think we've done well on there. In terms of, technology and commercialisation, and so we're missing a piece there. Now, I don't know whether that's something we can just learn from somewhere else or whether we have to do it ourselves, but we're not getting it right. We've got a lot of expertise, we've got a lot of, research capacity, we've got a lot of clinical capacity, world leading. We don't seem to be able to translate that, and just looking at it, Anna here has been very much in that space. We really struggle to get that over the line in terms of commercial companies, and whether that's something to do with the home market ease of access, and I think there's an aspect of that. I'm sure some of it's around access to capital and so on, but we're just not getting that bit right. It would be great to look to places like Israel and some of these other countries that are really getting that right, and see if there's more we can learn from that. I think.
Good point. Nice. Did you want to add one more thing?
Yeah, I can't.
And then down comes table 9.
So I think we've got a lot of investment opportunities for technology in Australia now. So we've had for a few years investment in translational research for medical products. But we've got now the Medical Research Future Fund, which is going to be an enormous long-term investment, which will allow us to, I think, further our research capabilities and the things that we are then able to commercialise in Australia. And genomics is probably the first major investment there, with $500 million over 10 years to start looking at testing and research questions around what tests we should be investing in. So I think there's a lot of potential, and the government's making the long-term decisions to try and improve the situation. And I also wanted to talk about the My Health record, because we've done a lot of work to get to opt-out. I'm much more sanguine, I think, than Hugh about the number of people that will be opting out. I think we've got a bit of media to get through over a couple of weeks, but most of my interactions with consumer groups, consumers are just amazed that we don't already have all this information. They think if they go to the doctor and claim Medicare, that the government knows about that and can join that up with their medicines data. So I think people are probably not as concerned about the issues as might be thought. And I'm really looking forward to the amazing applications of an opt-out system in terms of being able to collect data about how people feel after their hip replacements and things like that. The opportunities are fantastic.
Do you mind holding on to your response? Just that I know there's a lot of people want to ask questions.
Sure, yes.
Table 9.
Thank you. Janet Hiller, Dean of Health Sciences at Swinburne and member of the PICO Advisory Subcommittee of MSAC. So the front cover of Lancet this week, now it's turned around, states, continuing to argue for digital exceptionalism and failing to robustly evaluate digital health interventions presents the greatest risk for patients and health systems. And I wonder about the views of the people on the stage about that.
Evaluation
It's really
of digital
about
interventions.
health outcomes,
Yeah.
measuring health outcomes associated with digital interventions instead of intermediate endpoints.
Yeah, the problem is I don't think we're measuring health outcomes appropriately at all, and because we haven't had the data. So there are all sorts of interventions we haven't had the data to determine how effective they are. And until we have a decent health record system, it's fairly clear we won't be able to do that.
Andrew?
Yeah, look, I mean, I agree to an extent. I mean, I think, I think there's a lot of older interventions and technology that have not been well evaluated. I think as we bring new ones in, they're fairly comprehensively evaluated. But I think that's true. I mean, there's a lot of digital capability coming through in health that sort of slips under the radar or doesn't quite meet the threshold. I think there is a lot of risk in that. I mean, if it's purely measurement and providing information, arguably it's relatively low. As soon as it steps over that threshold, it doesn't even go through the basic level evaluation processes, let alone, health technology assessment type evaluation. So there is a lot of risk in that space. But it's a very attractive space to be. Running a company like the one I work for is a very expensive proposition in terms of what you have to do to get something to market. For a consumer-based company that just skips all that, you can have something to market with programs in weeks, which doesn't have to go through any regulatory process whatsoever. So that's a good proposition. Yeah.
So I'll come to table 10, and I want to come over to this side of the room as well, please, next. Yes, thanks.
Thanks very much. Anna Peters from the Deakin Institute of Health Transformation. I just wanted to follow up on the equity question and just get your reflections on the fact that because it's such a fast-moving area, do you think that we could do more to capitalise on the advances we've already made? So the example of kind of telehealth, remote health, that has huge implications for health equity in urban areas too. People with disability, mental health issues who don't easily leave the house could well be serviced by those capabilities. And I wonder if we can be a bit more strategic about using what we have already for more.
The only way we'll do that is through the GPs, and unfortunately most of them I don't think are equipped to provide that sort of education. So, maybe the answer is a massive education program for GPs to let them understand the technology so that they can pass it on to their patients. But I suspect there's a generational issue there. When I look at my son's medical colleagues, they get it. My generation, I think you've got to wait for us to die out.
But I think there's a challenge. I mean, outside of the world of GPs, I think there's a challenge though in payment, which is the biggest problem. So I mean, we have a number of solutions that we offer in other parts of the world around remote care and digital care. Their business models don't work in Australia because of the way that we've set up our payment systems. If you look at how you would go about changing an MBS payment for remote care, we've experienced how difficult that is, because often it's not a very, HTA generally tends on to having a fairly narrow patient population with a very clear clinical condition that you're trying to treat, and a lot of evidence that goes behind that. In a lot of the remote care services and digital health services, they serve a much broader group than that. So unless we want to try and evaluate each and every individual indication for that one by one, which is a huge task, we're going to struggle with it. So I think at some point somebody's going to have to make some policy level discussions around how to change those payment processes without necessarily going through the full evaluation every time. But that's a difficult policy position for government, because it potentially involves a risk on the costs blowing out. So it's tough.
So Penny, listening to David's question at the beginning about how we learn and how we learn from ourselves as well as from others, and then linking that question, what more do you think the government would like people to do so they learn from current successes?
So I think, the fee-for-service Medicare structure is a major barrier to significant reforms in some of the areas that we've been discussing. But the Medicare system is something that is well loved by the Australian community. And we definitely want to introduce, as far as we can, an evidence-based policy framework around what we invest in health. But we have to recognise that there are so many emotional, value-laden decisions that have to be made around a health system, because this is affecting people's lives. Do they live well? And it is quite difficult to effect reform sometimes because of the value lens that we have to put over the health system and the rational decision-making processes. But for instance, at the moment, if we wanted to invest further in telehealth, it would require funding under MBS items, which will be skewed towards doctors. The costs of those need to be considered, and it's a major investment potentially that we have to look at other opportunity costs arising from.
I agree with all. There are some other options as well, though. One of our businesses that we run in the US is purely based around disincentives to hospitals for rehospitalisation. So we can offer a service that keeps people out of hospital that is worth the hospitals paying us to deliver that, because it's cheaper than having the patients come back into hospital. So looking at some little levers around incentives and disincentives can build business models all by themselves.
Thank you. Thank you. Question over here on my left, sir.
Jacek Kowalski, Chief Data Scientist of Australian Unities. This is my question is for Hugh Bradlow. It's up his alley. You gave an example of wearable device that connects to a mobile phone. From the point of view of a company that provides telemedicine services, it's less than ideal solution, because you have all sorts of device management problem. But Telstra rolled out the IoT Cat-M1 network, which should address this issue. What do you think the impact of this technology is going to be on telemedicine? And are you aware of any applications being currently developed to take advantage of this new connectivity solution?
So first of all, it's good to see you after many years. So your question is, will the new IoT communications technologies change the connectivity options for those types of remote monitoring? I think that's the way I understood your question. Is that correct? I think most definitely, because it saves the intermediate device being your mobile phone, which is another point of failure. The battery runs out, people don't know how to use them properly, especially for those types of applications. So a direct wide area IoT connection, which is starting to appear in the market, will definitely be transformational in that regard.
Thank you. One more question from this end.
Hi, I'm Teresa Fells from Victorian Treasury. Question for the panel. I think Hugh's talk and all of your talks have made really clear how technology has the potential to improve the performance of the health system, but I'm just wondering whether technology itself can reduce or can solve the monopoly issue at the heart of the system, in the same way that it has been able to do so, for example, in the case of Uber, sort of undermining the taxi monopoly, or Amazon potentially reducing retail monopoly issues. Will technology itself improve or reduce monopoly power on the supply side?
Any views? Penny?
I've got some views.
Yes, Penny has some views.
So I think there are certainly parts of the health system as we know it at the moment that are going to be disrupted in the way that Uber has to transport. I think probably one of the main areas will be around community pharmacy, because we do have commitments right across that part of the sector to move to electronic prescribing, proper electronic prescribing, and we'll need to work with states and territories to make sure that legislation facilitates that as well. But once that happens and we have true mobility through electronic systems for scripts, it will be very difficult to stop companies setting up to distribute medicines through just normal logistics companies, the way you would distribute any other goods that people ordered online. As long as there is a pharmacist there that checks them, and in fact there could be some benefits to patients in terms of dose administration aids being packed in at the time scripts are filled and that sort of thing. So that's, I think, an area that is likely to be Uberized. And it's probably something that's been coming a long time as well, because governments have sort of protected that industry through ownership rules and things like that. And I don't think it will be governments that lead change here, it will be consumers. But there are certainly parts of the health sector that I don't think are going to be subject to the same sort of change, because they are not necessarily providers that are going to see a lot of competition. So, you know, there are very specialised procedures that can only be provided in tertiary public hospitals, and that's not an area I see changing.
Hugh, in your presentation, you talked about the power of the provider. Do you see technology in the same way Penny does, that it might be breaking this up slightly?
No, I actually see it far more radical than Penny does, because I think what we're not allowing for is the power of data, which we haven't seen yet. And the big data players understand that, and as I cited Amazon as the classic example, it raises a whole lot of questions about how do we control those individuals? I mean, who's going to custodies or whatever the expression is, but you know, who's going to control Amazon when they do get this thing right and they can actually create a real market for medical services? And then, you know, maybe the public hospitals won't win out for specialized procedures. Maybe someone in India will win out with a remote operated robotic surgery procedure.
It's because you're in my line of eyesight, but when you talked about the power of data, the whole of the IBM table nodded.
I was using their data, actually.
So actually, I think that's a really good. Actually, I think the biggest innovation. I think the risk problem is going to be a problem around real liberalisation of basic services, but I think the real innovation is going to come from. You don't like to call it artificial intelligence, but certainly, Medtronic certainly partnered with IBM Watson around some. Management services for patients with diabetes, managing their diabetes. And I think the insights that will come from data, and then the learning that comes from looking at those patterns and standardising pathways for patients through disease conditions, even complex ones, will be the thing that really, really does transform health in the future. It may not be a low-cost Uber transformation, but I think certainly many of the existing players, including ourselves, are going to be upset by the changes that are going to happen in that space. And clinicians as well. I think you'll find that some of this intelligence does some of the clinical work better than clinicians do, which doesn't mean we won't need them. We'll still need them to make decisions, but it'll be done in a very different way.
Thank you. Dr. Lavelle.
Yeah. Anna Lavelle, I'm a ATSI Fellow and also the Deputy Chair of Medicines Australia. Thank you for your comments so far. I'm very motivated about talking about this question of disruption and thinking about what's fit for purpose now and what is going to be fit for purpose in the future. And I just wanted to point out to people one example where we have an app in the US which has gone through the FDA drug pathway, and there's a prescription version and an OTC version. And you go to the doctor and you get prescribed this, it's for diabetes control, and you go to a pharmacist who gets a dispensing fee and downloads the app on your phone, and there's a cost share arrangement with the provider, and it's been shown to be extremely effective. Now that is the first one that I'm aware of. I don't know if there's anything else. Penny, you might be aware of some others in other jurisdictions, but I think that's the canary in the cage. It's the first time we have software that's been treated as a therapy.
Any views? That's a great comment. Any views on that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I'm not sure it is the first time, and I'd have to check that. But I think one of the dangers of software, and we talked about this a bit earlier, is you take the 23andMe example, where their little fight with the FDA. The problem is interpretation often. So you get told you've got some rare genetic disease. Well, so what? You know, do I go and have double mastectomies, or where do I go from there? And that's, I think,
that's not a good example. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is the challenge on those are going to be the pace at which you can improve. So I mean, if you look at your phone, every other week it's telling you to update your software. How much regulation is you're going to have to go through for every one of those updates? Because software is very easy to update. So I think that's going to be the challenge for that. But I think there's going to be a lot more of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I have heard of another app somewhere. I think there might have been another one. But there's lots of blurring lines everywhere here. It's software, but now we have things that are not quite medicines, not quite medical services. Things are changing a lot. So we're trying to adapt and be as flexible as we can. So MSAC at the moment is having a look at a therapy which there's no prospect of it whatsoever going on the MBS because it wouldn't be suitable for provision in any public hospital, a private hospital in Australia. But it involves taking a patient's cells, sending them to a lab in the United States, performing a proprietary genetic technique on them, sending them back, injecting them back into the patient, potentially curing their lymphoma or leukemia. So, you know, we need to be able to look at things that are, you know, not what we're used to having seen in the past and just sort of work out how we best assess those. And because that is potentially a very expensive investment, it needs to go through a health technology assessment. That's why we've asked MSAC to look at it. But the states and territories are involved in that as well, and are some particular hospitals and companies.
Any other questions? Gentleman on table 9, just wait for the microphone, sir.
Hi, Jason Howard from Swinburne University. Of course, we already have a lot of technologies, and GPs are prescribing more tests to diagnose things. So how are we going to make the jump to these new technologies without over-prescribing the whole way across? So America now is already spending more per capita than any other country, and for the first time in 60 or 70 years, their life expectancy is decreasing. So how are we going to make that jump to these new technologies without over-prescribing the old ones?
So we're trying to strengthen our health technology assessment framework for new investments in the health system at large. We don't want to see investments in, you know, like expensive robotic surgery that does not improve outcomes. And, you know, we've got some examples there where it probably would have been better if we'd had a robust assessment process. But, you know, we will be limited in some ways by our regulatory frameworks, by the demand, perhaps leading our capacity to actually assess and collect data that is needed for the assessment. So, I mean, it's just something we have to try and do our best on to make sure that we are talking to everybody making decisions about how we invest in the health system to ensure that they're as informed as they can be.
Pay for outcomes, not for interventions. Not yet. It hasn't really been tried very well in the US yet either.
I think the American system has to be nuanced. The life expectancy is going backwards for the lower socioeconomic groups. The wealthy are doing very well, thank you, but they kind of a very small percentage of the population.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any more questions from the floor? Ah, sir. Table 4, thank you.
Thank you. Earl Harvey, Minifab and Bionics Institute. Fascinating discussions. We often talk about processes and reviews and committees and so on. I was at a meeting in the US and everybody was raving on about the health economies of 3 N nations, Netherlands, Norway and New Zealand, apparently, are the exemplars in their eyes. I'd like to ask the panel, what's going to be the tipping point for us in Australia? Can you see something in front of us that will make things change faster than our processes are ready for?
Good question. Any view?
So, you know, again, because I think of things through a funding lens, because that's what I do. So I think private health insurance is a significant area of concern at the moment. We have to convince the community that private health insurance is something that we need to continue to have in the health system, that we need a balanced public-private system. And I think the level of concern around private health insurance is so significant at the moment that we need to look at some quite significant reforms. Now, the government has a reform package underway at the moment, but that might be something that needs to be looked at in future in terms of you know, more prospective risk equalisation arrangements such as they have in the Netherlands if we're unable to arrest the decline in private health insurance. So that would be one thing that made us look more closely at systems like that. I think New Zealand has done fantastic work around primary care. And, you know, I think everybody in the health system recognises that primary care is something that we have to invest in along with prevention so that we're not spending so much of our health dollar on hospitals and that very expensive care. But I'm not sure we're quite at a tipping point with primary care reform yet, but, you know, I feel that things are are probably building there. We've got the MBS Task Force review with a group that's looking very seriously at primary care and GP items at the moment.
I'd like to believe an opt-out health record could be a tipping point, but I'll wait and see.
I'm not sure if it's a tipping point, but I think it's critical. I mean, I think many of the things that we'd like to do better in health are enabled by the health record. And I wouldn't quite use the same words you used, Hugh, but I echo your sentiments around the health record. Some of the scaremongering around it is just crazy, but it really does enable a lot. But the other thing is, how much are we going to let it do as well? So at the moment, the way it's constructed is a really good base. What it's doing now is quite limited. What it could do is much bigger than that, but there's a long way to go before we allow it to do some of the things it could do.
Thank you. Thank you for some great questions. It's been a really varied... Oh, we've got one more question, have we? Sorry, I misunderstood.
Thanks very much to the panel for a really great discussion. Evan Rawstron from the Health Ecg and Human Services practice at KPMG. I think the two themes I've taken away this afternoon from the conversation are really about the velocity at which a number of these sort of technologies are coming towards our health system and how quickly our health system is having to respond, and secondly, the way in which technologies are converging to change the way we're delivering care. And so my question for the panel is really about the advice you'd give to leaders current and emerging in our health system about what they need to be thinking about in relation to technology and the way it's going to change the way it will change the way they care for communities into the future.
Everyone sat back.
I guess my advice would be you've got to, there are two things really. You've got to look at education. I mentioned the example of educating GPs to be able to disseminate the technology. And the second thing is you've got to look at every opportunity that presents itself. Now that's a challenge because there are a lot. And you know, who's going to do that and how they're going to do it is an open question. But you do you have to discriminate. I'm loath to mention Watson, which has been proven to be... Well, what I was going to say, it's been proven to be spectacularly unsuccessful in diagnostics. So, the fact is you do have to test the efficacy of the technology, but you've got to look at everything. As the venture capitalists say, you've got to kiss a lot of frogs to find a prince, so you've got to keep kissing frogs.
So from my perspective, the advice that we provide is just trying to draw out the evidence base. And what does the evidence base tell you? If you don't have an evidence base, you know, what does that mean? Does it mean that this doesn't work? Or does it mean that we just need to look at some other way of developing an evidence base if it's something that you're interested in? Trying to get them to look forward to opportunity costs as well, which can be quite difficult, particularly if somebody's being lobbied very heavily by somebody who wants an immediate investment, and that can be quite difficult to resist for decision makers, particularly where you've got a patient group that's demanding action immediately. But I mean, it's thinking longer term about what direction this will take the health system in, and what things you may not be able to afford if you invest in this now.
So I think my thought on that would be we actually approve and invest in quite a number of interventions and technologies based on their theoretical application, because in the theoretical world they actually are cost effective. What we don't do is adjust our healthcare system delivery to take advantage of the value. So sometimes we invest in it but it isn't delivered in the effective way, and then we actually lose the value of the investment. So I think we have to keep our healthcare delivery systems flexible enough that if we see something and we evaluate that it is effective and cost effective and we want to invest in it, we actually have to adjust the delivery pathway. So easy examples are we fund it but only fund it in a hospital, but actually its best value is if you deliver it outside of a hospital, but there's no funding pathway outside of the hospital. So we need to look at that and say, well, yes, we should invest in it, but we should pay for it in its most cost-effective delivery environment.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that last question, and thank you to everyone else for their rich questions and great answers from the panel, I thought. The technology debate is fervent at the moment. You can't turn on a TV or look at a newspaper or a website from a research to find something about technology every single day. When you look at where investment is in the world in terms of where people are placing their bets, the number one investment in the world is in software, but number two is in health. People are trying to find ways to disrupt the industries, as the panel has said. And I think it's been really helpful for you. Thank you for your contribution today, Andrew, Penny and Hugh, who I think have given us a great conversation and really enriching. Thank you very much.